Well, hey there, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. For those of you joining us for the first time, thank you for tuning in. I'm the host, Anthony Swindell, and I have a wonderful conversation for you today. I sat down to chat with one of my favorite professors, Mr. Tom Moritz, about a variety of topics, including Buddhism and addiction recovery. We talked about environmentalism. We talked about knowledge management, how we collect the data that we get, and what we do once we have it. And we talked about a lot of other little things in between. I'm really glad to be sharing this with you today because as fun of a conversation as it was to have, and it is to listen to, I think the importance of some of the topics that we touch on are really crucial for the time that we live in. We talk a lot about the environment and the changing times and really going forward in this post-truth world that we live in, and making sense and thoroughly applying the data that we are able to get. So I introduced Tom and his bio at the beginning of our conversation, so I don't want to talk too much right now, but I will say that there are some links available in the show notes to this episode, as well as at aflairforthecurious.com, where you can also listen to other episodes. I'm going to just jump right into this episode. I will check in with you on the other side of our conversation. I really hope everybody gets something good out of this, and I do encourage you to send me your feedback. I've received a lot of support already from people and encouraging words, and I really enjoy it. So please send me an email at aflairforthecurious@gmail.com or like and comment anywhere you listen. All right, here's my conversation with Mr. Tom Moritz.
And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
You're listening to A Flair for the Curious. My name is Anthony Swindell. I'm your host, and today I'm sitting down with Tom Moritz. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today, Tom.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and read your bio so everybody knows who we're talking to. Tom Moritz is a scholar and knowledge manager. His recent work is focused on the problems of big data and data as evidence. This means consideration of all aspects of data as the primary resource for science and for evidence-based policy formation and decision-making. At the Getty Research Institute, he served as Chief of Knowledge Management and Associate Director for Administration. At the Getty Research Institute, he led successful efforts to develop a comprehensive digital strategy. And at the American Museum of Natural History, he was Director of Library Services and oversaw scientific publishing. Tom has worked in the public sector and the nonprofit private sector, has successfully won grants from the Mellon and Sloan Foundations and the U.S. National Science Foundation, as well as from private donors. In fall of 2005, he served as visiting associate professor at the Pratt Institute Graduate School of Library and Information Science. He has served as an advisor to the U.S. Office of Personnel Management on big data. He has worked worldwide as an advisor on knowledge management and led in the formation of the Biodiversity Heritage Library and the UNEP-based Conservation Commons, which work included release of the first world database on protected areas, and serves on numerous advisory bodies and is author of many publications and presentations. And Tom, you're currently serving on the Death Valley Natural History Association.
That's right.
On the board?
Yeah, I've been on the board of the Death Valley Natural History Association. I did 8 years and then was off and then got reelected to the board last year. So, and they're primarily focused on supporting Death Valley National Park out in eastern California. Yeah.
Great. So it's a lot of conservation work, just keeping the lands protected?
They're actually a primary support for the national park. They actually run the interpretive center. I should say we actually run the interpretive center. And we also do other projects. So interestingly, we're responsible also for the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, which is across the state line in Nevada.
Oh, wow.
And it also happens to be where the Devil's Hole pupfish is holding its last stand. Yes.
So I know you from going to school here at University of the West as my professor, and in the environmental leadership class I took with you,
That's right.
We talked a little bit about that, and we got to see some footage and some data on that
right.
little critter.
Yeah, it's an amazing animal. Very few people even know that there are fish in the desert. And the Devil's Hole pupfish is a remnant, probably. It's a little survivor of the time when the valleys out in eastern U.S. and eastern California and western Nevada were actually lakes. Those Death Valley, Panamint Valley were large lake systems. And, of course, there were fish there. Mm-hmm. But as those lakes dried up, only little remnants of the original fauna that were in those lakes have survived.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it's really... And Devil's Hole is just a very small opening in the earth out in western Nevada. And there are only a few hundred pupfish that live out there.
Yeah, and so I took that class with you about a year ago, and we were talking about how they were doing some work to breed some of these critters in a replicated environment.
They've got some local funding actually from the state of Nevada and from local federal sources to build a facility where they've actually been able to replicate the Devil's Hole environment in an artificial environment. And then they've been meeting with some success actually in raising these pupfish in that environment. For example, when a large earthquake happened, like recently happened in Ridgefield, you get essentially tidal waves in that little opening where these fish live. So far they've survived, and they seem to have survived it for millennia, because there have, of course, been earthquakes all along. But nevertheless, it's nice to have a backup supply in the event that we should ever actually lose Devil's Hole by seismic activity, for example.
Yeah.
Or other human interventions. We don't know that, how that might happen.
Yeah, it's an incredible process. Yeah.
Really, it is. Yeah. They're miraculous little fish. I mean, I've seen them. I've gone out there many different times. And there are other desert fish that live in other bodies of water. They're related to the pupfish, but they're not the same species, same genus and species. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm curious how you got to where you are today. I know you are graduating 1964 class of San Gabriel High School, so you're
That's right.
a local native to the area.
That's
but
right.
I understand you mentioned and you were a toddler. You went back and forth between China. Is that?
I lived in China when I was a year old. My father spent about 10 years working in China. He originally was working with the YMCA, and then he was working with an organization called United China Relief. So in 1948. He took my then entire family, my mother, my older sister, and I out to Beijing. We lived in Beijing for a year. We were there through December of 1948. My mother says she could hear the gunfire on the outskirts of the city as the People's Liberation Army, the Communist Party, was moving into Beijing. And at the same time, the Kuomintang and the Chinese nationalist forces were leaving and eventually moving out to Taiwan. So that's somewhere in my psyche.
Yeah,
are those memories. But I did grow up with a lot of Chinese culture, because my parents had many books and artworks and other things from that experience in China.
Yeah, and were you connected to the Chinese culture here in the San Gabriel Valley growing up?
Well, there wasn't any when I was growing up here.
That was more, I guess, in the 80s we had a big increase in population coming over from China and Vietnam and whatnot. Okay.
Yeah. No, when I grew up here, I was at as you said, I was in San Gabriel High School from 1960 to 64. And the only large minority population was Chicano. We probably had 400 or 500 Mexican-American students. Very few, a few Asians, not many. I played football with a couple of guys that were Japanese American, and I think we might have had one or two black people, but at that time. And then, as you said, the influx of Asian people has occurred very much since then. So when I first came back, after being away from this area for a long time, I didn't recognize the area. Mm-hmm. Even my high school, they had large signs up in Chinese all over and Vietnamese around the high school. So
So I grew up from age 8 to 18 here in Alhambra, the crosstown rival, Alhambra High School.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I had a strong influence of Chinese and Vietnamese culture in my school. So I was curious. I'm wondering if your parents' endeavors and travels and cultural exploration do you think it affected your open-mindedness? Because I know when people travel and learn about other cultures, they tend to be more receptive towards differences and understanding. And in my experience, you're a very open person, and I'm just wondering if your upbringing
First of all, thank you for that. I hope that's true. My parents they're both very interesting. They were, I'm not sure, Anthony, how much you may be aware of this, but In the 1930s in the United States, there was a very large socialist movement. The communists and socialists were very active, and a very large union movement. There was also a very large movement of Christian leftists. And my father and mother, my father was involved with the YMCA as a student, a college student. My mother was at UCLA and involved with the YWCA. And they were both, at that time, both organizations were quite progressive, particularly at the student level. And my mother told me the story, she's gone now, told me the story of being at UCLA in the 1930s, and they decided to integrate the YWCA housing at UCLA and the YWCA itself. And so young black women were coming there, and the local American Legion came after them, said, we're not going to allow that, we're going to come in and threaten your meeting. And so my mother's story was they got the UCLA football team to come and act as bodyguards for their meetings.
Amazing.
And the American Legion didn't show up, apparently. So that's perhaps in the era of mythology, but I suppose we could do some archival work and find out. But I'm pretty sure she knew what she was talking about. By the way, she also, when under FDR's order, Japanese Americans were interned in 1941. I think was it December of 41? I think it was pretty quickly after Pearl Harbor. Many young women, particularly from the YWCA at UCLA, were shipped up to Manzanar, to the concentration camp at Manzanar. And my mother said that my grandmother from South Pasadena made boxed lunches to give people on the trains when they were being shipped out, and that my mother herself went up to Manzanar several times to make visits to people that she knew who were being held there in that concentration camp.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So your answer, and both my mother and father were involved with Quakers. They went to Quaker meetings in the 30s and 40s, which has always been, the Quakers, as you may know, are a peace church.
Yes. And
they were both involved with meditation and with the ethics of Quakerism. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you definitely had
I had that going on in my background for sure. Yeah.
That's incredible. Sounds like a wonderful way to grow up. So then you've been doing meditation since you were younger, or was it just in your awareness?
Very long time. I started on my own, meditating with the Quakers in 1966 in Washington, D.C. So there's the old, anyone who knows D.C., the District of Columbia proper, probably knows about the old Quaker Meeting House on Florida Avenue in the northwest part of Washington. It's an old stone building. I think it's probably 200 years old. Been there a very long time. They had blood thrown on their doorsteps back during the Second World War because the Quakers are pacifists, and many people accuse them of being treacherous to the government. And that's been happening for a long time. But that's where I started meditating, as I started going to Sunday morning meetings at that. And so,
what kind of meditation were they doing?
Well, the Quakers do the Quakers services, such as they are, they're called unprogrammed. Mm-hmm. Basically, what happens is that you go in, you have a starting time, everyone sits quietly, and whenever anyone is moved to speak, they stand up and speak.
Yes.
And so it's not exactly like a Buddhist meditation practice, but in many ways it's very similar. So that's where I got my start. I started doing that meditation at least on a weekly basis. And then very soon after that, my father died suddenly in 1968, in the end of March 1968. I was going to school in Washington, D.C. by that point. And my father died, and then Martin Luther King was killed 1 week later. And the whole city of Washington went up in smoke.
Wow.
68 was a very, very bad year for our country, for many of us worldwide, I would suppose. And, I would say that my Christian belief, such as it was challenged by that experience, both of loss of my father, and also by the sort of trauma that many of us were. I stood up on a building on the Thursday night that Martin Luther King was killed. I was standing on top of a building in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Actually, Bill Clinton was there too, by the way. He and I were classmates at Georgetown. We weren't good friends, but we were actually happened to both be up. I remember this distinctly. And we were looking out to the east across the city, and there was the National Capitol with the lights on, but then flames were jumping up against the sky from 14th Street, and I think 6th Street was the other street there was massive burning going on. And that image is just deeply imprinted in my mind. In many ways, it shook so many fundamental sources of trust and belief that I had. And then that year went on to be even worse. So we had the Chicago Convention, and Richard Nixon was elected president. We were in the midst of the Vietnam War, and many of us were hoping that the war would end. We were also, by the way, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, and I had gone down and done voter registration in Mississippi, 1967. So it was a very difficult period. The point of my mentioning all of that, though, is to say that I had been studying Buddhism a little bit in an academic way in one of my classes at Georgetown, and it suddenly began to make sense to me. This was in 1968, so it's more than 50 years ago, but it began to make sense to me. And
what is it? Buddhism?
Yeah, I couldn't account for the reality. When my father died, for example, one of the ways Christian ministers, for example, would try and comfort and say, well, God in his mysterious ways, we don't understand why these things happen, but they happen, and that wasn't satisfying to me. It didn't make sense to me that would be true. It didn't feel real to my experience. And so Buddhism, at least as little as I understood it at that time, seemed to offer something more like an explanation that I could understand. Part of which is just to say the reality of the world is that, in Buddhism we say all human beings, if they live long enough, are vulnerable to old age, sickness, and death. And that's not nihilistic or fatalistic. It's simply coming to terms with the reality of the world and say, this is the way the world is.
Yeah, that's, I think, a big part of what drew me towards Buddhism. It's a pragmatic approach.
I think so, yeah.
There are many, many traditions, and some of them can be more esoteric or more cultural or ritualistic, but at its core, it tends to fall back on a very pragmatic approach to approaching life and the circumstances that it encompasses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. So you said you were at Georgetown. You also studied at UCLA and Columbia University in New York.
New college and then New School.
New School?
Down in the south end of Manhattan Island. Yeah.
Amazing.
It took me 8 years to get my undergraduate degree, and I sort of migrated around. At the time, I was doing my best not to get caught up in the Vietnam War. I actually was 1A. I don't know if you guys may not know that, but 1A meant I was immediately susceptible to draft.
Yep.
And I was 1A for about 18 months, and actually had what's called a pre-induction physical down in New Jersey. But I had made my mind up that I was not going to leave the country, and I'd also decided I was not going to refuse induction, because I felt it was my duty as a citizen to accept my responsibility to be inducted. But I did tell the Army people that I was talking to that I would not accept orders to Vietnam. So that was where I was never forced to make that determination, but I did tell Army intelligence.
Yeah. Such a hard line to skirt. It
was a difficult, we all came up with different solutions. Many people in my age class, my cohort, my age class came up with different solutions, and people came up with different ways of responding. But that was the way I came up.
I admire that. You're willing to do your duty as a citizen, but you're going to stand your ground for what you believe in simultaneously.
That was sort of what it came down to. Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm just very grateful that I didn't have to actually do that, because I would have wound up in the brig or depending on where I was, or stockade, depending on which service I was in. So
yeah, and that wouldn't have really been helpful for anybody.
They weren't very kind to the people that went through that. Many people did go through that.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah. So while you studied at these various schools, you studied literature and English and French and ethics, labor history, and internet.
New School. That's where I did that. Yeah.
Nice.
An old-time radical school. So
that's incredible. And then also I have down here you did international affairs and library science.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing, you had a rich political, cultural upbringing and background, and so I'm curious, that clearly informed your adult life, and so from your studies and your experiences in the 60s and early 70s, how did you get into knowledge management and teaching here at University of the West?
That's a good question.
Yeah, how did you get from there to here?
Sure, yeah. Well, I can tell you briefly, I was being tracked to be a lawyer or a diplomat. That was what I was being tracked to do, which is how I wound up at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Despite my best efforts, I did very well academically. Eventually, I mean, my academic record's a little like electrocardiogram, but yeah, I did very well and was accepted at both Berkeley and Georgetown. I started out, by the way, at Santa Barbara, at UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, okay.
And then after 2 years there, was accepted at both Berkeley and Georgetown, and made the decision to go to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. It's a very small school. I don't know what it is now, but it used to be about 150 people, very small, and had a very high percentage. It was still sending more people into the State Department than any place else in the world. So I was being tracked in that direction, but at the same time, as I said, I was getting more and more engaged with civil rights, with the anti-war movement. And when I say engaged, I mean we were doing very simple things, like we had a peace vigil once a week for an hour at Georgetown, where a group of us, a Jesuit, one of the Jesuit faculty, and a few of us students would stand out with signs simply commemorating all the people that were dying in the Vietnam War. And there were students there. I remember they threw a condom full of water on top of us. We were silent. We weren't agitating. We were simply trying to memorialize or bring to mind the people that were dying on all sides in Vietnam.
Did you only get that negative feedback? Was anybody appreciative that you were out there?
Well, originally, not very many. I mean, that was my general sense. I mean, there was a small group of us that did it, and more or less that small group, we had a community action program at Georgetown, and one of the Jesuit advisors took a group of us down to Mississippi, and we did voter registration in Sunflower County with Fannie Lou Hamer. So she was one of the very well-known leaders in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So we went down there and did that, and it was gradually the whole country was going through transition at that point. The black communities were very often in open rebellion. There were riots, fires, gunfire. National Guard troops were being sent into America's cities, and eventually, so things through the 60s, things seemed to just get worse and worse. And we had an administration, particularly once Richard Nixon was elected, well, actually when Lyndon Johnson was there too, who simply seemed not to be able to respond to the public will. And the thing that I mentioned already is that at that time, many of us were being drafted. The lesson that they seem to have learned so that they can fight their discretionary wars now in Iraq or Vietnam, or Afghanistan, wherever else we're fighting, has been use volunteer troops. Don't use draftees. And
make the economic conditions so bad that people are eager to volunteer to get any help that they can get.
If people are looking for promotional tracks or a track out of the communities that they're in, the armed forces provide a way to do that. So,
yeah. And then so many of the island nations that are American territories have huge percentages of people signing up. And
That's right. Yeah.
Tragic. So how did you get into knowledge management?
Well, I started to go there. Basically, I was being tracked to be a lawyer or a diplomat, but pretty soon I'd become persona non grata. It was pretty clear by my political positions that I wasn't going to be a good diplomat. And I actually ended up taking the law boards at one point, and I did pretty well. I used to test pretty well on a lot of things, but somehow at that time, about 1972, I got a job shelving books in Washington, D.C. at the Department of the Interior Library. And my mother was also interested in libraries at that time. And my supervisor, who was the chief librarian there, the National Library of the Department of the Interior, said, I think you should go to library school. So I went home to New York at Christmas time. Pratt was willing to accept me on very short notice. I gave him my resumes and my credentials, including my test scores and so forth, and they accepted me for January in December.
Oh, wow.
So I started a one-year program to get a Master's of Library Science at Pratt.
Oh, wow.
And from Buddhist standpoint, I think it was a right livelihood decision.
Yes.
I began to really think about what my day-to-day life as a lawyer or a diplomat might have been like, even if I tried to do that. And librarianship seemed to me to be one of the most harmless professions I could follow.
Yeah.
And so, and I was right, I think, actually. I still believe I was right. It was one of those, it was some sort of grace entered my life in the sense that I was able to see that even at that point in my life when I was pretty confused and pretty distraught. It's still because of my father's death. But nevertheless, I got into that program. And that led from from graduate school to I returned to the Department of the Interior, worked there under temporary orders. I did some work at the National Academy of Sciences. And then we moved to, my then wife and I moved out to Seattle. And I eventually got into graduate school there in international affairs, Chinese regional studies, and did three and a half years of graduate work at the University of Washington.
In Chinese regional
studies, yeah. Chinese language, literature, anthropology, history, art history.
Wow.
Philosophy, all of that. Yeah, it's a good school.
Are you fluent in Mandarin?
No. Well, I mean, I studied it for 3 years, but that was, remember, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So I've actually, since we've been at US, I've thought about kind of resurrecting my Chinese.
Yeah.
I have a little bit still,
Yeah.
probably because I grew up with it. When I, even when I lived in China, I was very little, but they said it was my first language.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I just took one semester of it here, but even having that little bit of access, I feel, it's allowed for just some funny moments sometimes, or I can recognize a little bit of characters around town. And having grown up here and been immersed in Chinese culture, to take that one semester offered me a little bit different insight, and I felt more connected to the community that I grew up in just by taking that one class. It's pretty amazing what language can do.
Speaking it is possible, but reading it is one of my professors who's I have a lot of affection for still was I'd walk into his office and he would be sitting there, and this was he was already at the teaching graduate school. He'd be sitting there with his flashcards, just rehearsing, because there's so little in our Euro culture that reinforces Chinese, particularly reading. And depending whose numbers you use, there may be as many as 80,000 characters in the Chinese written script.
Yeah, I hear you only need to know like 5,000 or so to read a newspaper.
Well, actually the number was
3,000 or so.
Started at 2,700 was the number that was actually used. They began a newspaper literacy program. Actually, the YMCA in China began that in the 1920s, 1930s. They also began physical education. But the notion of Chinese newspaper literacy was what was really led to the 2,700 number. Yeah. And that was obviously an effort to make what had been a very exclusive form of education, only for very elite groups, available to everyday people. So
fascinating.
Yeah, really. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Okay, so that led you to knowledge management. So before we dig into your work as a knowledge management specialist, let's, say what is knowledge management? Can we define that?
Well, sure. I think it's interesting. I, as a matter of fact, was just lecturing to the class that you took. I'm teaching it again this semester. And we are looking at what's often called the knowledge pyramid. And it starts out at the very base with simply the reality as we apprehend it, which is the whole universe, basically. And above that, there's a layer in this pyramid, we can visualize it. It's hard on the radio, but there's or on a podcast. But there's a layer that basically has to do with data that's selected or measured by human beings. So that's a subset of reality, and then on that basis, we make hypotheses, theories. I would say reasonable associations of data that lead us to try and explain or account for phenomena that we see in the world. All right, and then when we get consensus from a significant group of qualified people, that those speculations, those theories, hypotheses, can be confirmed and considered to be knowledge. That is actionable, some sort of actionable truth about the real world.
So the difference between information and knowledge is information is the raw data, and the knowledge is the applied.
That's right. Associations, I would say associations of raw data. And raw data becomes evidence when it is being selected and focused on particular problems. So in other words, when we want to address a problem, the one I think you have been through in my class, and I'm just about to start with this next week, is the story of cholera. Then we follow that with the story of Ebola and AIDS. And in each of these cases, we were confronted with crises that we couldn't, with our current levels of knowledge and understanding, really explain at all. And we, as often happens when we were faced with these situations, human beings came up with contending theories about how, for example, in the case of cholera, there was a very prevalent belief that it was caused by bad air, by vapors. There was what was called the miasmatic theory of cholera. And they were convinced that that was what it was doing. And even the London Board of Health, even when presented with very conclusive evidence, refused to accept that evidence. They were so convinced that they understood how cholera was communicated. And in fact, we now know that it's waterborne and it's a bacterial infection. And we actually had the pieces to understand that in very short order. Cholera broke out in England, I think, in 1832. And then we began to see a series of these cholera epidemics that they would recur. And throughout the first 20 or 30 years, the British were unable to accept, the authorities were unable to accept that there was clear evidence that cholera was waterborne.
So I wonder, what is the psychological factor that gets somebody who has clear evidence of something that goes against their beliefs? What is the psychological factor that allows them to shift into accepting the evidence that's presented in front of them?
Well, that's the big question. In fact, it's the crucial question we're facing right now on this planet.
Exactly.
With respect to climate change.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue. And so why is it that our beliefs are so inert? That is, I think it was Newton said, inertia is the tendency of a body in motion to stay in motion, or a body at rest to stay at rest. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm using it in that latter respect. Our ideas are very, very fixed. Human beings can be very, very intransigent. Once we think we have an understanding of any phenomenon, we find it very, very difficult to release that prior understanding and accept any new theory. There have been one of the examples, actually, I've just finished talking about this in class today, is that it took 350 years for the Vatican to accept the Galilean theory that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the Earth rotated around the sun. Galileo proposed that 350 years ago. Now 380 years ago. And it wasn't until about 1994 that the Vatican actually accepted that Galileo was right. So there was an intransigence, an inability to simply... And so what you had in that case were layers of resistance. I mean, the individual, the question of whether an individual... in fact, I'm quite sure there were Catholics, including people at the Vatican, when Galileo was alive, that could accept the plausibility of what he was saying.
Do you think it's an issue of authority? Because, like with climate change, those at the top who are denying it are the ones who actually understand the implications of what would have to change once everybody acknowledges and accepts climate change. So at the top, the deniers are doing so that the uneducated will support them.
You may be giving them too much credit. They may not have that depth of understanding. They certainly understand.
Like the super rich and elite that are running
certainly
things?
Being asked that they need to make changes. But they may not actually understand. They may not consciously know how much they are in denial about the reality of the world. That's I'll tell you something. Back at the time we were fighting both the civil rights movement in the 60s and the anti-war movement, I was 20-something years old. My first civil rights march was a sympathy march for Selma in 1966, I think. That's when I first took a public action that I remember my friends laughing at me. But at that age, I don't think I comprehended how much resistance we were facing, how powerful these forces of inertia are. When we're talking about wealth, for example, the entrenched wealth of the world, we often talk about the 1%, and there's a tiny fragment. The data I've seen recently, I think we have 3 people who have as much wealth as the entire lower 50% of the population. I think that we don't understand just how powerful those people are and how desperate they are to protect their wealth. And the same thing was true during the Vietnam era, although at that era there was a paradigm of the Cold War that was being used very much to defend everything. Like Vietnam was actually a discretionary war. To a certain degree, Korea was as well. But certainly Vietnam was a discretionary war. I would juxtapose that to the Second World War. World War I, perhaps, but certainly World War, the Vietnam War was clearly a choice. We made a choice to go into that war and to engage. We were not, no matter what they were saying at the time, we were not facing any imminent threat.
Yeah.
They were not coming across the Canadian border or across the Mexican border to attack us. And that's still a kind of a threat that's being raised by our leaders. But the reason we were fighting that war was because they were feeling threatened. They were fighting an action to resist any challenges to the financial structure that was prevalent and is, in fact, it's even more prevalent, I'm afraid to say, now than it was then. So a lot of power.
A lot of power, yeah. And I imagine there's only been more networking since then amongst the elite. It's really entrenched. So going back to the knowledge management, in trying to just do a little bit of research about what that is before talking with you, most of the applications that I found were people talking about their personal knowledge management, of knowledge managing their emails and whatnot, and then most of the content was related to business and how to maximize efficiency and all the capitalistic keywords of using this to be more efficient and more profitable, managing your data within your business.
Sure.
So I know that those aren't necessarily your goals in life, so I'm curious what your application of knowledge management has been and how it can be utilized, because it sounds like we were also talking about interpreting the data so it's used appropriately in scientific means or through social justice or conservation. So what has been your application, and how does that differ than other ways that it's used?
Well, I mean, you're right. When knowledge management is talked about today, it's very often thought of as a method that can be used for greater profit in many for-profit corporate settings. That's certainly true. And in fact, many corporations still do a terrible job. I mean, it's surprising. They are doing things. I once at an international conference met a fellow working for the Ford Foundation. Not the Ford Foundation, the Ford Corporation in Detroit, whose job was simply to make digital copies of every resume that was sent to Ford. Wow. And they were trying to build a giant database. In other words, essentially a pool of potential candidates that they could analyze and then use efficiently. I don't know how far Ford actually got with that effort, but they've tried. I was at a meeting at the National Academy of Sciences probably, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and one of the representatives of the pharmaceutical industry was there and was talking about a closed database of scientific papers of over, my recollection now is that it was over 200,000 scientific papers that they had locked down and were not making publicly available because they considered it to be a corporate asset.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And if you think about it...
that's one way to not manage knowledge. Is
if you think about pharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals are set up to, presumably, aid the process of human health under potentially some conditions of urgency. I mean, people are dying when they don't get the medicines they need. Yeah. Simple form of the problem. Yeah. And yet, under the for-profit motive, these companies are limiting access to life-saving pharmaceuticals. It's worse than that, actually. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you may remember, there are cases of companies not only creating pharmaceuticals, but also creating, for example, pesticides or herbicides that have been demonstrated to cause cancer. And the same company that manufactures these herbicides or pesticides is also manufacturing anti-carcinogenic drugs to treat the cancers that they're causing.
Yeah, it's a sociopathic business model, and nothing short of it.
Right. And to come back to your question, your original question about knowledge management. Knowledge management is really about asking ourselves, how can we most effectively and most efficiently develop and apply the knowledge that we have? And there are many people have written in this area, but it's been speculated, for example, that most people who reach at a professional level and maybe in their seniority, they're maybe sharing 5 or 10% of what they know. It's just a rough estimate. It'd be very difficult, of course, to measure that. But nevertheless, one of the goals of knowledge management would be to optimize the degree to which people can share the knowledge that they actually have as a result of long academic study and long professional experience. And under conditions of urgency, again, which I would consider all healthcare situations essentially to be urgent.
Yeah.
But by the way, climate change is also urgent.
Yes.
We can't afford not to optimize our use of knowledge.
It's the ultimate health concern.
That's right. It is. And I mean, implied in what you just said is the fact that, knowledge and health, health and the environment are not separate entities.
Yeah.
There's this weird dichotomy, particularly in American culture, where we give the National Institute of Health $39 billion. That's their NIH budget for 2019. And the NSF is getting $8 billion. NSF, in theory, which, and by the way, I've worked with them in the past. I actually worked with both, but mostly with the NSF. The NSF is covering all sciences.
Wow.
All forms of life, everything. And the NIH, to a certain degree, is doing that, where microbiology is involved. But there's still a huge disproportion in how we're investing our public funds, and that's anthropocentric. That's just human-centered.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the crisis that we face. But the other problem is that we're just inept.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you take a person like myself, or any of my peers who have worked professionally for many years. I'd like to think I have a lot of knowledge and experience that could be appropriately applied in many different settings.
I think so.
And I've been given many opportunities to do that. I'm very grateful for that. But people reaching my age, why are we not finding ways, much more systematically and much more skillfully, to do what's essentially called knowledge transfer from older, more senior people? And it's not about more my wanting salary. I really would like to be able to share much more effectively and efficiently my experience, and do it in a way that isn't repressive. Younger people growing up don't want old people telling them what to do, and I get that. I'm not worried about that. I simply would like to offer the possibility that there may be insights and there may be ways to do that. And to a certain degree, our social media does permit that, but it's not in any way systematic enough.
Yeah.
I can give you a very clear example. When I was at the Getty, I was at the Getty Research Institute, and we managed the Getty Scholars Program. We had an amazing array of scholars come through there. Susan Sontag was there.
Oh, wow.
Many, many different people. A local guy I like a lot named Mike Davis was a fellow. And we've had many, many really wonderful people come through there. They would come and spend 6 months or 8 months at the Getty, living in residence there,
wow,
participating in seminars. And when I was there, I suggested that we turn the Getty Institute into a knowledge capture environment, that we equip every conference room with recording devices, not unlike what you and I are working with right here. Nothing quite as nice as what you've got, perhaps, but nevertheless, with the ability, for example, if I was, let's just say Anthony's a scholar or Tom's a scholar, we're sitting down and we start a conversation, and we decide this is getting interesting. Bump, we hit a button, state, date, time, and we simply record it.
Yeah.
We simply record it, and we create archives of knowledge exchanges at a very informal level. Mm-hmm. And we develop and apply software that could analyze, classify, make available to future generations that conversation.
Well, how was that received when you suggested it?
Very few people understood what I was talking about. I believe very few people. The Getty has the resources to do it. They could have. Uh-huh. We did other things. For example, I'll give you another example.
We have national archives, right? Everything.
Well, yeah, the national archives. But again, that's pretty much like records management. Uh-huh. In other words, when I finish doing what I'm doing at the NSF, I box things up and send them over. And the archives may occasionally do what's called oral history. Mm-hmm. But this is taking things to another level.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I wanted to give you one other example of something we did there. One of a local California artist gave his entire archives. He basically, that's being generous. He loaded up not a dumpster, but one of those pods, moving pods, with everything, and he gave it to us. We took it. But what I suggested, and what we actually did with the help of other friends at the Getty, is we decided to have him go through his own archives and talk about it.
Oh,
and
wow.
we recorded him. We had an overhead camera and we had microphones, and we recorded him talking about his own archive. Now imagine this. Imagine that you had Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
Doing, or take your pick, anybody, any of our
so much more valuable to have all
and
that context.
Then you have the
background.
ability to actually see him. You can see him looking at a document. For example, this guy drove a map. I can remember he drew a map of Topanga Canyon, where I used to live, and talked about back in the 50s and 60s where the artists all lived in this area.
Wow.
And he talked about the communication, literally day to day, between these artists and how people. We went to parties here and we did that there. So that's in my mind a very good example of how this could work. So let's jump ahead to an entirely different environment. Let's talk about the U.S. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. I have a good friend who's been a lawyer at the EPA for many years. I have a great deal of confidence in him and trust in him, and I trust similarly he has a huge amount of experience. So here's the question. He won't be retiring for a while, but pretty soon. The question becomes, what is the best possible way of capturing the knowledge that he walks around with up here in his cranium, other than simply preserving his emails, which are good, by the way. I mean, emails are better because emails are often much more colloquial, much more discursive than just a formal report or a memorandum. But still, how could we best possibly capture that information and that knowledge and make it available in a way that's useful and efficient? That's the fun. This goes back to your original question, what does knowledge management mean in its best sense? And under conditions of urgency, which we're absolutely under right now with respect to climate change, loss of biodiversity, take your pick.
Yeah.
I think there's an imperative that we have to be doing and finding these kinds of solutions. And I'm sure I hope that there are people out there who have been thinking along these same lines and are trying to discover these, but I don't know that there are, but I hope that there are. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, it makes me think, like, the other day, I was in a class, they asked, if you could have dinner with anybody, who would it be, right? And it's like, there's so much more that you get from a conversation with somebody.
That's right.
Teasing it out than the report.
Or in a good class as well, by the way.
Yeah. Any kind of open dialogue is really important. So, to speak to what you just said, that one of the reasons I have you here is because I enjoyed your class, but you're a community elder, and I value and appreciate your wisdom. Yeah. And I'm happy to lend this. Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to lend this platform to your voice because I think it is important to preserve your knowledge and promote it and have it out there. And to that continued point, you said, you think you should. Knowledge should be passed down generationally, but obviously young people don't want it imposed on them. And in this world of sound bites that we're in, where everybody wants, now they tell you how long it takes to read the article at the top of the article, right? 3 minutes, 5 minutes, That's 10 minutes, 30-minute read, and that doesn't get any clicks. So that's kind of what I think a lot of people enjoy about podcasting. It's an informal. This is very conversational. It's non-threatening because you're not forced to listen to it.
I very much agree.
It's optional.
That's right.
And it's long format. Sometimes people try to keep it tight and go, half hour, or there's like updates, the weekly news, and you can get like little 2-minute, 5-minute podcasts.
Sure.
But some of them, this show, I've done 2-3 hour long episodes, and it's long format. And I think that's something people are really enjoying, going back to that long format, conversational, teasing things out. You can go as deep or as wide as you want.
It's better than The Apprentice.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, so I think it's maybe a little bit of even of the pendulum swinging back the other way. People want that long format. They want that information. They want that more colorful explanation of somebody's process.
Right.
I've been so enriched by podcasts. It's what brought me to this school, and it's what allowed me to connect to communities that I didn't know existed when I thought I was getting into something and I was maybe an outlier. And I'm like, oh, wow, there's a whole other group of people interested in this. And podcasting really allows people to talk about that more in depth, the long form radio. So, yeah, I'm really excited that we'll be able to share your stories with a larger audience.
Thanks, Anthony.
Yeah. So what are some of the projects you've worked on with your knowledge management skills?
Yeah. Those are good questions. I would say the two things you mentioned actually in reading through that resume. I mean, one is that I worked on a project that we originally called the Conservation Commons, and we ended up calling it the Biodiversity Commons, which was an effort to recognize that all of the information we have about global biodiversity has not been well collated and not well focused. So I was working in natural history museums for over 20 years. At the California Academy of Sciences and then at the American Museum of Natural History. I actually, as a Buddhist, had sort of a bad conscience in some ways about working. It's like working in a catacomb, if you think about it. If you really believe that all organisms should be respected, our museums, we don't actually know worldwide, but we think it's more than 3 billion specimens of all types of organisms have been collected in natural history museums. And by the way, the natural history tradition, pretty largely a product of the European imperialist experience.
Has it changed in recent times as views within the culture are more progressive?
It has changed to a certain degree, but those residual collections are still out there. So one of the questions, the point of that was to say that I began to wonder, well, how can I transmute this experience, these large vaults full of many types of dead organisms into something that might be creatively useful?
I love that.
I and other groups of people thought the same thing. I wasn't the only one. I'm not in any way claiming that, but there have been many people who have thought about it. But with our understanding of computer technology and our ability to do data capture in a whole variety of ways, we decided that, of course, we could start to make available data about these collections in aggregate. We could put together the collections from all around the world and start to develop something much more like an aggregated understanding of biodiversity. Now, it's still arbitrary and there are still inconsistencies and gaps. It's not a good sample, a perfect sample, but it's a pretty good sample in some respects. And some areas have been much more heavily sampled than others. One of the best collections of Paraguayan plants is at the Geneva Botanical Garden, strangely. And so if you happen to be looking for that, didn't know that, you'd be up a creek. But once we started to aggregate these data and make them available through a single international system, we and the community that I was part of developed something called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which I think is still headquartered in Copenhagen, if I'm not mistaken. And so that was one kind of an example. On the library side of things, we developed something called the Biodiversity Heritage Library. I was at the American Museum in New York. I had colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London, at the Smithsonian in Washington, another colleague up at Harvard, at the Zoological Museum up there. We began to put together the idea that we should digitize and make available the literature of biodiversity worldwide. The journals, the books, everything we could. Even in my case, at the American Museum, we did archival work. We actually digitized, we imaged, and then actually had transcribed handwritten field notes from the Congo. And so they've become fully searchable. And you can see the original.
So all of this stuff is online? All the stuff you just mentioned?
That stuff is online. The Congo material is definitely online.
Do you know the site?
It's called...
or at least the name of it?
Probably. Well, if you look at the American Museum... AMNH, American Museum of Natural History Congo Expedition, you can find it.
Wow.
And we put together, with the support of the Mellon Foundation, by the way, to give credit where credit is due, we put together a very thorough website on that particular expedition. We did it as a prototype because at the time we were hoping that similar prototypes would be developed for these major natural history expeditions wherever they occurred worldwide.
Yeah, lead by example, right?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that it's actually happened to any significant degree, unfortunately. But some of that material is being digitized. But that was one. Another example that we did was working with. I ended up, through a series of professional decisions, working with the World Commission on Protected Areas in Geneva, part of IUCN, the World Conservation Union. And we worked with the World Conservation, these are a lot of acronyms, sorry, a lot of names, but you can't avoid them. World Conservation Monitoring Centre in Cambridge, UK. They had a long-standing history of support to protected areas, and they actually had a little database. But we put things together there in such a way that we had for the first time a global database of all protected areas. By protected areas we mean national parks, national forests, state parks, anything that has been set aside basically as public land for protection, marine protected areas. So we put together for the first time a comprehensive database of all the protected areas in the world.
Incredible. Is this a public database?
Yeah, it's called the World Database, WDPA, World Database on Protected Areas.
Amazing.
And part of the logic of that was that if you put together the two projects I've just described, we began to put together a historical record of species occurrences worldwide, going back probably 250 years, and a history of where our current database, what our current protected areas worldwide are. We could start to do what's called gap analysis. We could overlay the species occurrence data, at least the current species occurrence data, with the occurrence of protected areas and see to what degree our protected areas are actually protecting endangered species.
I'm getting goosebumps as you're saying this. That's incredible. That's wow. That's
called gap analysis.
An amazing use of that.
Yeah.
That
so
information.
that was the point: is to end up with two data sets at international level that would allow us to actually compare and look at the effectiveness of our world database program. Basically, if you think of it that way, they're actually governed at the national level primarily, although there are international protected areas as well, biosphere reserves, World Heritage Sites, and so forth. But nevertheless, these are predominantly national. But what it does do is allow us to tell, if we go to any country, we could tell them, this is where it looks like your species are, particularly the species of concern, the threatened species, and this is where it looks like your protected areas are, and let's ask how, just a very simple-minded question, how well are your protected areas actually protecting the organisms, the plants and animals that need to be protected? So, it's a start.
Is that something that has been implemented, or did you just do
both of those things have been implemented.
Are they ongoing endeavors?
Yeah, sure. And not only that, but I could give you another really interesting example. I have a friend who's, I believe, still at the University of Kansas, Town Peterson, who probably 20 years ago began to take data about species, like species profiles, which includes, by the way, habitat suitability, where these habitats should be, and was able to take that and then project those suitability factors onto geography, like say in Mexico, and predict the occurrence of a rare species, because he could say, here's a cluster of habitat characteristics that seem to match the needs for this species. Climate is right, vegetation is right, soil perhaps, altitude, the other factors. And he actually was able to successfully predict the occurrence of an endangered bird simply by looking at those data.
That's incredible.
So it's brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant work. And also, by the way, he was able to project the spread of invasive species. Like we were having a big problem in the United States with beetles being introduced. He was able to project, given what we know about those species, where they are most likely to go next. So there's a lot of brilliant work going on out there.
Sounds like there's so many different applications when you have such rich data to work with.
Yeah, but Anthony, this comes back to what I think we talked about at the origins of this. We have a lot of knowledge, and we have very effective knowledge tools, but the critical piece is what happens with that knowledge. How does that knowledge how do we wisely use that knowledge to create policies at local, state, national, international levels to accomplish the goals that we have for ourselves? And these goals include, of course, human health, the health of other species, the health of ecosystems, clean water, clean air, all of the factors that are most essential to human survival and to the survival of our fellow species on this planet.
Yeah. Wow.
So
that's incredible. I guess referring back to what we said about the health of the planet is the health of our health is
That's right.
is linked to that.
Our bodies are ecosystems.
Yes, and comprise the greater ecosystem.
That's right.
So one of the things I absolutely loved about taking your class was that you are the only other individual other than myself that I've ever heard address a group of people a third your age and tell them you are not separate than nature. And so I don't know how well it was received in the class, but I live with my nephews and my
mixed reception.
Mixed reception, yeah. I got a kick out of hearing you say that, because literally I think within a couple months before I heard that in your class, I was talking to my nephews and my niece about the very same thing.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, they wanted to squash a bug in the house.
Yeah,
it's like, oh, this is a good teaching moment. Let's talk about our connection to what nature is.
That's right.
Yeah. So I really appreciated that. So with that understanding, what I guess maybe to kind of wrap up our time with knowledge management, what would you like to see in the future of how that's applied and how this change in policy can come about and all the things you said of how it needs to be applied? What would you recommend?
That's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. So I know it's a hard one to tackle, and I don't expect any concrete answers. But
here's what I'd say.
Ideally, what do you think?
I went to library school in 1974, and at the time I studied computers at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. That was one of the two emphases that I focused on, and at that time I wrote a paper for my professor of information science using Noam Chomsky's deep structural language. I'm not claiming to be a super linguist or anything like that. I'm just saying I waded into it.
Yeah.
And I came up with a concept for an oral, that is hearing and spoken interface between computers and human beings. It seemed to be science fiction at the time. It seemed so far-fetched that we didn't really believe. Here we are.
Siri, can you get the data on that for me?
That's right, exactly. Absolutely, exactly right. We do it now. We have that capacity. So there's been a huge growth. And for me, the World Wide Web itself is what's really amazing, because the World Wide Web is, in a certain sense, if you enter, not all librarians enter libraries, to really share information or to help people, empower people to satisfy their own information needs. I did. That was part of the ethos of librarianship for me. But if you think about it, the World Wide Web has gone far beyond anything I imagined at the time. We now have access to literature, scientific literature, to imagery, take your pick, and to the very best minds. So we have a tremendous resource out there. But, and here's the big problem, as an information scientist, anybody who studies information sciences knows, the signal to noise ratio has gotten very, very bad.
Yeah.
The noise out there is deafening.
We just listened to a TED Talk in my capstone class, The Paradox of Choice.
Right, exactly.
Too much choice, and then you're...
Well, that's the signal to noise ratio. It's simply saying that the material, it's there. I mean, but it's drowned so often in this flood. I mean, that a national leader of the U.S. could stand up and be convincing people that news is fake and news is false, and there's so much to distrust. And, well, in a certain sense, he's right. Unfortunately, he's part of the problem, not part of the solution. But nevertheless, part of what we have to do is develop critical skills for, on the one hand, we have access to knowledge that we've never had before, worldwide. And this is actually true worldwide. I've worked many places worldwide. I remember getting an email from a guy in veterinary school in Pakistan asking me for information in New York because he couldn't get access to the journals he needed there.
Oh, wow.
And somewhere he got my name, and he reached out to me and sent me an email. I still have a copy of that email.
Yeah.
And and so the information is there, but it's not in any way uniformly distributed. And in some cases, as I mentioned in that story about the National Academy of Sciences, some people locking it down. Mm-hmm. They're trying to, for better or for worse, I'm afraid the Disney Corporation's been an example of some place that has unnecessarily been willing. And that's a whole other discussion. I don't even go there. But there are corporations who protecting information has become, intellectual property has become one of the unquestioned mantras in the United States. And I question it. I think that there are many aspects of information, intellectual property, that should not be locked down. If you have a very large financial stake, the Disney Corporation, I say to them, blessings on you. If The Little Mermaid is extremely valuable, Snow White, take your pick. Those are your properties. But don't lock down the rest of the information universe to protect your own device. And that's where I think there's been a lack of subtlety up to this point.
Well, I mean, the argument is that capitalism breeds progress, but we're seeing the exact opposite in this restriction of technology and information.
It's a form of repression. And so the point in all that is to say that one of the things we need to do is we need to develop better tools for identifying the relevant material, the essential material in this universe, to address that noise to, signal to noise problem and help people get the signal, which in the case of global warming or climate change is really a huge amount of data, very, very good data, and to be able to at the same time develop the critical skills, the acuity, the critical analytical skills to be able to see and understand what is true, what isn't, and what's essential and what isn't essential.
Yeah.
So all of that's a tall order. I mean, it is. And the problem is, even when we haven't been under conditions of urgency, which we now are, apparently, it's been a problem. But now it's an emergent problem.
Absolutely.
Exactly in the sense that we use that word, emergency. It's an emergent, urgent problem, and we need to develop these tools, and we can't keep fumbling around with these problems. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So I guess my question was how can we implement these ideas and techniques? But I'm hearing you say that in 2016 the OED word of the year was post-truth, right? So, and we're experiencing all this truth decay. So, I asked about a solution. You're like, well, we need to first be able to decipher what is useful information, and that's really scary, I think.
Well, the Rand Corporation, as you may know, actually used that phrase, truth decay. Mm-hmm. They published a paper, or actually a report, just last year, focusing on this problem. And so the question really becomes, how what I want to say is I'm frustrated by the idea that we need to do this democratically. I want to do it democratically, and I want this material to be as free. And that's why I teach here, by the way. That's why I like to teach the classes that I teach, because we have very diverse student body here, and I love to teach in this environment with that kind of diversity. But the challenge is for people to develop their critical analytical skills individually, and then to consider how can we step forward and start to apply this. So my course, the course that you took, is called Environmental Leadership, has two very significant components. Of course, the environmental component, which is really getting out the facts as quickly and effectively as possible, presenting this global situation that we're in. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, also getting the people to think as clearly as possible about what leadership actually means. And it goes to your question, really, is that what can we do now, and how can we most efficiently do it? And I wish I had a single formula or solution for you, but I'm sure that it involves developing as teachers, as fellow students, as members of organizations that are focused on particular problems, focusing on being as rigorous intellectually as we can be, and as rigorous as we can be in terms of the types of evidence. It's interesting that in the United States, or actually perhaps in worldwide, in the last, I would say, 20 or 30 years, there's been this catchphrase called evidence-based medicine. Mm-hmm. And I always thought that was a little ironic, because you sort of hoped all along that maybe medicine was evidence-based. Yeah. You thought, oh well, maybe my doctor really has got some evidence for what he's saying. But this is developed as a movement in medicine. And so, but the way I take it, actually, I think the most positive way to take it is to say that we're setting more rigorous standards for the screening and analysis and vetting of data. And I have a whole nother class that I've never taught, actually, that would actually in detail go through that and talk about that. I've been doing, over the years, for example, we have a National Comprehensive Cancer Network that's made up of about 30 or 40 major research institutes in cancer. And they have set up pretty rigorous standards for how they select, how they identify evidence, how they evaluate it, and they have different criteria for evaluating it and making recommendations. For example, if you do clinical trials, research-based clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, RCTs, there are certain criteria that they insist on applying. Well, that's great. I mean, I hope if and when I have cancer, I may have it now for all I know, but when I do, if it happens, I hope that they have really good, solid science. But what I really wish is that we had the same level of rigor and scrutiny for these global problems that are threatening the existence of our entire species and the whole world.
Yeah.
So that's the big picture image here. And the question becomes, in a world where nationalism and sovereignty are hugely problematic, If you think about how long it took us to arrive at the Paris Accords that our president has just unilaterally decided that we're going to not participate in, those accords took a couple of decades to actually put together.
Yeah.
And they're only voluntary. I mean, the idea of pulling out of them is ridiculous because we were voluntary anyway. We're under no international law that forces us to do it. But, the point is that we need to come up with a strategy for thinking systemically, too, both of those, about the global structure, where the resistance points are, where the obstacles are to, one, the free flow and access to essential information, data and information, evidence, in other words. Mm-hmm. And secondly, what are the major obstacles, the major sticking points for creating global policies that may actually save our species, save our grandchildren, our children and our grandchildren. I tell my classes, you probably heard me say this. I mean, I'm turning 70 this year, and I could live 30 years. May not live more than 10. I don't know. I mean, who knows? But the classes I'm teaching, like this morning, those students are almost all in their 20s.
Yeah.
In a normal lifetime in the United States, assuming, or even in China for that matter, those students are going to live another 40, 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
And the world that they're going to grow up in, they're going to mature in, and their children are going to mature in, is the world I'm talking about,
Yeah. I hope you get to teach that second class. That's something, I really enjoyed your class because I thought it gave us the foundational information to be leaders. Yeah. We tackled the issue of information using the environment as all the examples. Yeah. And then we each did that report on the Goldman Foundation.
That's right, the Goldman Foundation.
The Goldman Foundation. So we each did a report on local activists.
Grassroots activist leaders worldwide.
Yeah, so we each got to share a report on a different activist, and that, for me, was really inspiring. I did Putker from India and how they're challenging the dams there for the local people. But I learned so much from all the reports, and they were wonderful examples of what everyday people can do when they rise to the occasion and step in to speak truth to power.
And with courage, too.
Absolutely, yeah. And they face tremendous pushback from people with power and money. Yeah. But one of I think I mentioned this to you after the class one time, that it left me feeling after the class, like, okay, now I've got all this information, now how do I apply it? And then I think you said something to the lines of, well, that's the question right now.
Good luck.
How can we do it? Yeah. So that's why I would definitely encourage the school to take you up on that second class, because it's a strong foundational class to get what we need to know to become those future leaders. But too often, I think we wait until we have a problem to look for a solution.
That's right.
And we need to be proactive.
That's right. That's exactly
because this climate issue, it seems like it's far away, and the scientists keep telling us it's closer and closer, and we're experiencing worse and worse every year. And it requires proactivity.
That's right. One of the reasons that I like to teach about epidemiology, that I teach about, as I said, cholera, Ebola, and AIDS, is that I remember walking into my Kaiser healthcare facility whenever the Ebola crisis was happening in West Africa about 2 or 3 years ago, and hearing the nurses talking about Ebola. And this is in Culver City, I think, was where I was. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? And of course, we had just been through the situation where a patient with Ebola had flown from Liberia to Houston, had gone to a local public hospital, and had been sent home with aspirin after he had Ebola, and he died 2 days later. That got people's attention. Mm-hmm. But the issue that you're raising is, with climate change, what is it that's going to get people's attention? We know, for example, that Hurricane Dorian, that's moving up in the Carolinas, and wiped out the Bahamas. I worked in the Bahamas for several years on a regular basis down in Andros Island. We know that the intensity and the frequency, probably the frequency, we're not as sure of that, but certainly the intensity of these storms is being seriously affected by climate change, by warming ocean temperatures, which means more moisture in the air. The size of these storms is increasing, and probably the internal dynamic. We're still learning about the internal dynamic of hurricanes, but it's probably being severely affected by climate change. And New York subways were flooded, by Sandy.
Yeah.
I mean, I show my class. You probably remember I showed classes pictures of the subway tunnels flooded up to the subway platform in saltwater.
Yeah, I'm originally from New York, and I have friends there, and it was a traumatic experience for people who were there.
Absolutely. So these things start to get people's attention, but the problem is that, as you said, most of us, most of the time, just want to get through. We want to be comfortable. We're pretty complacent. Not too many of us are willing to rise to a challenge. And yet, at the same time, it appears that the forcing pressure of climate change is leading us to a point when we have to respond.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, I just posted a World Bank report on Facebook just 2 days ago, looking at this question of displaced populations. And they're predicting that very soon, within the next few years, we're going to see as many as 180,000 200,000 people.
Climate refugees
moving around the planet. And it's going to get much worse.
Yeah.
If you look at Bangladesh, you look at the many other places where there are
they're saying the heat waves across North India, Bangladesh are going to be...
Right. I mean, there's another very interesting report
horrible.
We could go on and on. There's another interesting report saying that people with taking psychotropic meds, for example, are homeless people, many of whom are being given drugs as they live on the street, that the effects of those drugs are adversely affected by increases in temperature.
Yeah.
That bipolarity, if you're a bipolar without drugs, that heat can increase the intensity of your experiences, and that some psychotropic drugs are also being affected by heat.
You know what, I saw something a couple days ago that was saying low-income areas tend to be like 10 degrees hotter, and it's just like city planning and whatnot. And
city island effects, that's part of what goes on for sure. Yeah. There have been a lot of studies in that area, yeah.
Wow.
No doubt.
Yeah, we could list a lot of examples. So let's switch gears a little bit here.
Sure.
You mentioned you really enjoy teaching here at this University of the West, because it is diverse and it's open, and we've got the Buddhist influence at our liberal arts college. So I want to move into the class you teach here in Buddhist addiction recovery.
Sure.
But maybe before we get into Buddhism and addiction recovery, how did you come to teach here? What led you here?
Good question. I've been on the board of a number of different organizations. I was on the board of a group called Buddhist Global Relief. Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's a very well-known Buddhist scholar, probably the best known, one of the very best known translators of the original Buddhist text, the Pali Canon, into English, was based, when I was working in New York, he was based in New Jersey at a Chinese Mahayana monastery down there. And I heard he was down there, and I thought, well, I think I'll go down some weekend, and I heard him give a talk, and he was giving a class in Pali, the original language of Buddhism, and I began to take that class. I got to know him. We got to know each other. He asked me to serve on the board of Buddhist Global Relief.
Oh, great.
So, and through that context, I got to know the then head of the chaplaincy program here at University of the West, Danny Fisher. Danny has since left the university, but the program continues to be a strong, if I'm not mistaken, the largest Buddhist chaplaincy program in the world. And so I got to know Danny. And Danny also knew, we haven't talked about it in this interview, but I have had to deal with substance abuse in my life. And so I had been looking, in fact, my own experience with substance abuse was that Buddhism was very significant in helping me to come to terms with my own problems with addictions and alcoholism and addiction. So Danny knew that. We talked about it for a while, and he invited me to come and teach a course in the chaplaincy program, which I did. I had taught at Pratt Institute when I was in New York, but this was the first time I'd actually tried to teach a course, which was primarily not based on my professional academic experience, but more on my personal experience, both with Buddhism for going on over 50 years now, but also with recovery from alcoholism and addiction, which has been well over 30 years now. So bringing those two things together, Danny and I talked about it, and he said, well, why don't you give it a try? And for those who haven't thought about it, it's essential for people studying to be chaplains to be able to understand, at least have a working understanding of the impacts and the effects of Buddhism, of alcoholism and addiction on our communities.
Yeah.
And so that's the story of how I got here. And then
that's great.
I got from, I'm forgetting which year it was, but I think it's been probably 5, 6, maybe even 7 years since I started teaching. And then once I got here and began to teach, I ended up being able to teach in other areas as well. And
what other courses do you teach?
Well, the two that I've taught consistently are one on Buddhism and addiction, which is now in the psychology department, and the other is a basic course in environmental leadership that you've taken, which is based on my professional experience, and that's in liberal arts.
And then you've helped out in some of my other classes.
I've taught many different psychology classes.
Philosophy class with Karen Jelinas you helped out in.
Yeah, that's right.
A few other things. They get you on board here and there.
I helped to co-teach a course in Buddhist psychology. I've taught courses in trauma and religion. I even did a social psychology course at one point. So
cool.
Helping to try and pinch hit and help out in different areas. So,
So I think I may have said this before, but it was a podcast that got me to this school. Danny Fisher came out on the Buddhist Geeks podcast, and he did an interview, and I had heard about that, and in reading a transcript, I saw that, there's a Buddhist school in Rosemead. Right. And I was looking to come back to LA, and I was like, I think I'll go back to school.
And by the way, it's one of LA's best kept secrets.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
It's a treasure. It's a treasure. But yeah, so that's how I got here. And to the idea of addiction and giving back from our own experience, but before I came here, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and listened to a lot of Dharma talks, and I listened to this one woman speak, and she had overcome her eating disorder, and was I forget if she was a nun or not, but she was deeply embedded in Buddhist communities, and she was leading this discussion, and she said she had always thought she was going to do some kind of amazing thing and contribute to the world and help people in some amazing way, and she didn't realize it blew her away to realize that it was her own addiction recovery that would be her gift to give back.
Right.
And I myself, maybe I was in my second or third year of sobriety when I had heard that, and it nearly brought me to tears, because I've had that direct experience in my own healing, sharing my own journey of healing, whether it was going to therapy or just quitting alcohol, just trying to love myself and be a better person. It's rubbed off on people in my community, or given them at least pause for thought on their own actions. So I think it's really important for people who are on a healing path to just talk about it. I'm not telling anybody what they need to do or they should do, and by all means indulge and get it out of your system if you need to. But when you're ready, and if you're ready, there is a path, and it's been successful. So now I'm coming up on my 8th year without alcohol.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Or I guess this is the 8th year. It'll be the 8th anniversary in December.
Well, I'll make a further comment about that. One is just two things quickly. One is that it's an interesting fact that the Buddha, when he picked the 5 basic ethical precepts for Buddhism, which are pretty much accepted worldwide.
Which are no killing, no stealing, no lying, no sexual misconduct, and no
Bhikkhu Bodhi has it down to 5 words. So it's harmlessness, honesty, faithfulness, truthfulness, and sobriety. So you can say it in 5 terms. I meditate with those 5. So the 5th one, of course, is sobriety, which is and so it's a very interesting thing to ask. Well, when he was considering these problems 2,500 years ago, isn't it interesting that the Buddha named sobriety, or abstention from substances that cloud the mind, drugs, alcohol, and other, Thich Nhat Hanh suggests many other things, that abstention from those things became a high priority for him. Now, I've written an article that actually Danny published and co-published, where I mentioned that in Buddhist mythology, there's some mythology about who the Buddha was before he became enlightened, or before he went forth, before he became a monk, and he grew up in a palace. So it's very probable that he was exposed to inebriation, to people. We don't know. It's possible that he himself got drunk at some point, but he certainly saw other people who were suffering from addictions. India, there was alcohol and drugs in India at that time, and it's sort of like California in the 21st century. There was a lot of material to be exposed to, and so he made a decision that it was really critical to address that for anyone that was going to practice Buddhism in the way that he was suggesting that we practice. The other thing I want to mention very quickly is just to say that the American Psychiatric Association has a process that's called Differential Diagnosis, which is how they suggest that a therapist or psychiatrist a series of steps that they go through in first encountering a potential new patient. But the steps are, number one is you want to rule out malingering. You don't want, if it appears that you have to ask yourself, are they really presenting a problem? But the number two issue that they suggest eliminating is drug or alcohol addiction. Is this person under the influence of drugs or alcohol? This is before you look at any other comorbidities, any other co-occurring factors like bipolarity or anything else. They say, number one, rule out drugs and alcohol.
It alters the baseline.
Because if you don't address that, and if you don't find that and address it immediately, you're going to have a very, very difficult, it's not impossible, but you're going to have a very difficult time getting to the maybe perhaps deeper seated, more underlying problems. So, psychiatrists, psychologists talk about this in a lot of different ways, but nevertheless, I think there's a reason that their strategy for differential diagnosis highlights the importance of addressing alcohol and drugs first.
Yeah.
Before you get to the other factors that may or may not be present. So.
Yeah, that's valuable for sure. So before I ask you about what Buddhist addiction recovery is and what you teach in that class, I think maybe for people who aren't familiar with Buddhism, I would like to say what the Four Noble Truths are, because I think that's kind of foundational to this discussion.
Absolutely.
So as we said, there are a great variety of traditions within Buddhism, but they all kind of fall back on some of the central tenets, which include, like you said, the 5 precepts, and one of what is said to be Buddha's first teaching of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So the Four Noble Truths say that dukkha exists, and dukkha is often translated as suffering, or it can be inherent dissatisfaction. We might think of the hedonic treadmill. You get what you want, and you always want something else, and so it's this idea that you're always wanting something, or you're always wanting to reject that which you don't want, and that creates suffering. So suffering exists in the world, and it's part of the human experience. That's number one. Number two, our attachment to the things that we want, our cravings, our thirst, our hunger, and our aversion to things we don't want is the cause of a lot of this suffering. So it's our attachment to our cravings and aversions. And the third one is that if we can curb our attachment to our craving and aversion, we can curb our suffering. And some call it cessation, whether it can be stopped altogether or not. I mean, maybe there's some debate, but certainly being less attached to these cravings generates far less suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. There is a path to achieve this cessation, and we don't have to go into all of that, but there are some practical steps for how to live your life with the Eightfold Path. So I think it's really interesting that you have the Four Noble Truths plus the Eightfold Path, and for math scholars, they'll already know that 4 + 8 = 12. And so I would say that Buddhism is the original 12-step program.
For all of us, by the way.
For all of us, because we're all addicted to getting what we want and avoiding what we don't want. And so, I think in the path towards happiness and well-being and understanding truth, it's a wonderful method for getting over our addictions. So one of the things I'd like to at some point get to as we talk about it is the difference between the Buddhist addiction recovery and the traditional AA 12-step program. But before we get to that, maybe we can say what is Buddhist addiction recovery, and how do you teach it in that class?
Well, I teach it for a whole semester, but I'll just make a few comments that'll help in response to your question. First of all, as you said, or you implied, this notion of the first noble truth, or dukkha, or suffering. Suffering has a little bit of a melodramatic, I would say, purple.
So I try to give it a few extra words.
You did, and there are some excellent essays out there that sort of give the full range of experiences that constitute what the Buddha was talking about by dukkha. It can be distress, disturbance, feeling ill at ease, malcontent, discontent. I mean, it's a whole suite of problems or issues that human beings experience, which when we talk about them, almost everybody says, I have that. Maybe not all the time. I mean, that's part of the trick. But yes, so there's a whole suite of problems there. And there's a Buddhist scholar Buddhist psychiatrist that I like. Mark Epstein has a book called Everyday Trauma. there's been a lot of discussion of trauma in our culture, probably driven as much by the number of returning Vietnam vets and then veterans from other wars, and the beginning to really recognize what's called attachment disturbances, the impacts on children of painful or difficult experiences, the failure of caretakers and caretaking environments to provide a secure and happy place. So taking those kinds of situations together, many of us experience trauma in different ways. And one of the ways that we cope with it, to think in terms of our second tradition of the noble traditions in Buddhism, is to say we often, because we can't fully acknowledge that we've suffered in those ways, or because it's so painful to acknowledge that we've suffered in those ways, that we seek aversion. We try to avoid or dissociate from those feelings and those experiences. And of course, one of the primary ways that we do that is with drugs and alcohol. It's a form of dissociation, of trying to self-medicate, make ourselves feel more comfortable. In my case, I began to drink, and unfortunately in the 60s began to use some drugs. I say unfortunately because I don't believe in either one of them now, but pretty early on in my experience in college, when I was off by myself, I was an immature young man, and I was struggling with how to come to terms with, what does it mean to be a man in this world, or a woman for that matter, or a human being? What does that mean? How do we come to terms with that reality? And it was extremely discomforting. I was really, by the way, didn't know that I was struggling, and I was really, really unhappy. Mm-hmm. And then, through some set of conditional circumstances at my university, some people said, try this. I did, and I felt fine.
What was this?
To drink. Just to drink some alcohol.
Yeah.
I said, I feel fine. This is good. This feels good. And so that was it for me, and that set me off in a path. And I now know, by the way, we know that there's a genetic component to alcoholism. It turns out families do not normally talk about alcoholism and addiction. They don't like to. Mm-hmm. But in my case, I know, if I look at my 4 grandparents, I know up 3 of those family trees, there is some evidence of alcoholism. Mm-hmm. I had a great uncle who was a World War I vet who wound up in the logging camps in Oregon. Had an uncle that came to my father's funeral with a briefcase full of fifths of alcohol. It goes on and on and on. And so there are lineages of alcoholism. We're pretty sure about that. I'm not blaming it on that. I'm just saying that the precondition, seems to be one of the preconditions for a tendency to become alcoholic or perhaps addictive as well.
It's certainly my experience.
Yeah. So, it's there. And as I said, most families are in denial about it. They say, oh, well, he was funny, or he just had some, they come up with, by the way, they actually do some true accounting for deaths in the United States. They've made efforts to do that because doctors, out of respect for families, very often will not put down drugs or alcohol anywhere near the death certificate.
Wow.
They'll explain it in other ways. So there have been efforts to try and go back and account for the real causes of death in the United States. And it's a very different number. There is data. You can look that up. There are papers and data on all of that. I mean, there are many, many other costs of addiction, alcoholism too. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, just to come back to your question, it's just a question of, and so Buddhism provides a pretty good understanding, not just about drugs and alcohol, but about all of the ways that we develop mental states that divert us or lead us away from facing the reality of our lives, mm-hmm. the basic truths of being alive, which certainly include, if we're lucky, growing old, sickness, death. Jim Morrison said there's no exit, or no, Jean-Paul Sartre said there's no exit. Jim Morrison said there's no way out of here alive. Take your pick. But I'm just saying it's a reality of the world. And some people hear that and they think of that, well, that's morbid. Well, it's not morbid. It's just, it's better to engage with the truth, and that's the truth, than it is to try and live in a fantasy world where that isn't the truth. And the Buddha's lesson was that if we engage with that truth, we can come to terms with it, and in fact, it will increase our gratitude for what we do have in our lives, for the people that we meet in our lives, increase our sensitivity and our ability to respond wisely to the world as we see it. Mm-hmm. And it will also ultimately lead us to the recognition that every human being, everybody, is motivated by more or less these same constituent problems. We talk about the three poisons in Buddhism of appetite or greed, of ill will or hatred, hostility, judgment, and finally ignorance, simply being unaware of the reality. And I was saying to our class this morning, in my opinion, virtually every human problem can be analyzed in terms of some combination of those three factors. Yeah, I think the Buddha was right on 2,500 years ago. So,
yeah, and the author David Loy talks about how these three poisons are institutionalized in our society these days.
Right, and David Loy talks about the environment a lot too.
Absolutely.
In fact, he's leading a workshop this next year, I think, in Barre, Massachusetts, at the Insight Meditation Center.
Yeah, the book that just came out at the top of this year is Eco Dharma.
Yeah, I've got it.
It's on the shelf. I haven't cracked it open yet, though.
Yeah.
So you teach this class to psychology students graduate level psychology students who are going on to be MFTs and Master of Divinity students as well?
And chaplaincy students as well. We taught it last semester, and we had about a half and half split. And there were several monks. Let's say there was one monk and several nuns, I believe, in the class last semester. So
yeah,
it's always flattering to me to be able to say I'm teaching nuns and monks.
Yeah, that's one of the things.
I'm laughing at my own vanity.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So a side note, something I wanted to mention is your social media feed is wonderfully curated.
Oh, thank you.
So I really enjoy. You have some really interesting articles, and I trust your knowledge vetting. So I always am curious.
I try to be careful. I try to be careful what I put up there.
Yeah, but you also post when you're around town at different places, and one of the things that you sometimes post is that you're meditating at Homeboy Industries or other places around town.
Sure.
So I'm curious if you share any, or do you just go meditate there, or do you do any kind of informal teaching?
I help lead the classes, the meditation classes. Father Mark Torres is the director of spiritual development at Homeboys. I think I've been going down there 5 years now, something like 5 years.
Can we say what Homeboy Industries is?
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely. Homeboy Industries is based in downtown Los Angeles. It was started in the 1980s by Father Greg Boyle. Father Greg is a Jesuit, as is Father Mark, my friend Father Mark. They actually share a Jesuit residence down on Boyle Heights. Father Greg was assigned to Dolores Parish, I think in 1982, which was at that time the poorest parish in all of Los Angeles. And he landed down. He grew up in L.A. and he landed down there, and he's in an area that includes 2 separate housing projects that are also, the way this goes, separate gang turfs. And so the area between them is often a war zone. And so Father Greg became pretty quickly aware of all of this. And he used to go out and ride his bicycle. By the way, he did a little time in Bolivia, too. The Jesuits sent him down there. But he came back, and one of the stories I love is he was riding his bicycle. He's out there, this white guy. This was almost 40 years ago, so he must have been in his late 30s, early 40s, something like that. Riding his bike around at night, and he sees basically a gang fight developing. Groups of people, big crowd, people are starting to argue. You can hear the voices. So he tries to intervene. He walks out into the middle of this group, and one of the people pulls out a gun, a handgun, points it right at his forehead, right in front of him. And Father Greg says to himself, well, I guess my ministry is over. But fortunately, he was not shot.
Yeah.
What he did do is he persevered in that environment. He worked out of the church, the Dolores Church down there, and a major breakthrough for him happened when he realized that one of the fundamentals that he could offer there was not just his teaching as a Jesuit, as a Catholic priest, but also when he realized that if people simply didn't feel that they were in these dead-end environments where they couldn't escape, that maybe that would make a difference. And so he ended up being able to, by a strange set of circumstances, to acquire a bakery. And he began a training program for some of these men and women that he was working with. I think mostly men at the outset. But he set up a program where they could learn to be bakers, and then they started producing breads. In fact, I forgot. I was going to bring some over here today. I forgot. I was going to leave it for the students in the class. I'll have to bring it next time. But anyway, so that was the start of it. But where it went from that was it developed into a full-service community program. So that today, if you go down to the corner of Bruno and Alameda, it's about, interestingly enough, it's about 3 blocks from the California Endowment and about 5 blocks from Union Station in downtown Los Angeles, very near the Chinatown subway stop. There's a 2-story building down there, and he provides services to, I think, on the order of 1,500 or at any given time, full enrollees in the program. Mm-hmm. And the program includes people coming out of prisons are being given a full set of basic training programs in parenting skills. What does it mean to be a parent? They're given opportunities for therapy. They're given opportunities on how to write resumes. They're given job direction or how to find skill sets. I've known people that were getting metalworking skills, welding, a variety of really basic tools so they could go out and find work.
Wow.
They have an honor roll up on the wall down there of people that have gone out. Some people have gone to work in the industry in Hollywood.
Oh, wow.
So that there's a very large selection. They've been very, very successful. And they continue to provide. And one of the interesting things, Mayor Villaraigosa, former Mayor Villaraigosa of Los Angeles, was down there. I heard him speak down there. And he used to have tattoos. That's a news flash. But he realized that a lot of these guys with gang tattoos all over their necks and faces and arms were having a very hard time finding work because it's a form of scarring.
Yeah.
And so he helped them acquire tattoo removal machines. And they have a tattoo removal program that runs pretty much 5 days a week from morning to night. And every single day, people are going in there, and doctors are coming in and volunteering their time. Cosmetic surgeons, people that do that work, are volunteering pro bono and giving that service to Homeboy Industries. So,
my first guest on the podcast, Pat Cornett, he grew up, ended up in gangs, and then went to the military. And then when he got out, he had a hard time getting a job. And he mentioned that he actually got some face tattoos removed at Homeboy Industries.
Well, Father Greg tells a story. One of the people he was working with who had on his forehead tattooed "F the world."
Wow!
I mean, it wasn't just the F.
Yeah.
And he said, Father, I'm having a hard time finding a job.
Yeah.
And so I know a woman who has F-U tattooed under her eyes. Mm-hmm. So you can see, and how people and why people get these tattoos, that's a good question. That's worth pondering and asking yourself, why in our culture and society are people arriving at this point in their lives? And so Father Greg has tremendous love and sympathy for this population of people, and one of his comments that I like the best is he says, ultimately, or sooner or later, we all come to realize that kindness is the only strength there is. Kindness is the only strength there is. And he acts out of that and has for a very long time.
I have a little bit of trouble with some of the Catholic Church, but when it comes to the Jesuit branch, I'm always completely awestruck with the level of sincerity that they bring to their devotion towards being kind and inviting people in. Mm-hmm. It's really wonderful.
Well, I've had my problems with the Jesuits too.
Oh, really?
I went to Georgetown University, which is a Jesuit university, and we had a little bit of difficulty, I and the Jesuits, but I have gone long past that myself.
Yeah.
I hope they have too. So.
That's great. Yeah, so we took a field trip down there, and they've got a full-service restaurant as well. That's delicious food and
Homegirl Cafe.
And people coming through. Anybody can go down there and enjoy some good food. It's really an amazing. And we took a tour.
Yeah.
Given by a former gang member, and that was a really wonderful experience, I think, for the whole class. I definitely really enjoy it. Yeah. So I'm curious, how do you share your knowledge of Buddhist addiction recovery differently with a group of people who are struggling than you do with people who are looking to be professionals? Well, it's in that field.
It's a whole spectrum. Everybody. The first thing to do is to get every human being whoever they are, whether they're MFT students or chaplaincy students, or people right out of prison. I just yesterday was teaching down there at Homeboys, and was talking to a guy who had fresh out of 20 years in prison.
Wow.
And he was trying to work out. He was very, my initial response was he was a very sweet guy, very friendly, and I could see his gratitude. But my opinion is that first thing to do is to get everyone to recognize we're all on a spectrum. I don't believe in that there's an elite group over here that has a special proprietorship for knowledge and wisdom and grace, if you will, and then there's the rest of us folk over here on the other side. It's a spectrum. And part of it is getting everyone to recognize the degree to which they're caught up in dukkha, or suffering or disturbance. Now, it presents itself in different ways. Obviously, we don't all, here at UF, some people have tattoos, but not too many. Certainly not too many of the faculty that I'm aware of, but it's very important to recognize that these problems are not cosmetic. They're not superficial. They're actually common problems for all human beings. That's what I was trying to say a little earlier about addiction. Addiction and alcoholism is a specialized form of aversion. In my opinion. And by the way, one of our Buddhist teachers likes to say we walk around in a trance of habits. That most of us, most of the time, walk around unconscious of our thought processes, of our speech, and of our actions. And so getting everyone to acknowledge at some point that there is this common factor that the Buddha identified is really fundamental. Now, having said all that, there are extremities of response to that circumstance. Now, not everybody becomes an alcoholic addict. Not everyone becomes a heroin addict. I mean, people don't all respond to trauma or distress or dukkha in the same way.
Yeah.
So that's very important to acknowledge. But it's a common human experience. And so we have to adjust our teaching. Like if I'm teaching in fact, it was interesting. I was asking the class this morning. I was talking to them about my experience yesterday down at Homeboy's. And I was asking our class, well, what do you think are the common responses if you ask someone who's had serial trauma in their life, trauma from birth, trauma in the family, trauma in the neighborhood, in the community, in the schools, in the prisons, in the gangs, who's experienced all that kind of trauma. So let's take such a person and ask them to sit down and meditate. What are most probably the common responses that you're going to get? What are very common responses? Frustration, anger, agitation. That was the first thing somebody said. One of the students said, yeah, angry. They're going to resent it. And that does happen occasionally. Now, at Homeboys, they've already joined the program. In theory, they're there to participate. But I've certainly heard that. In fact, I haven't had it happen to me yet, but Father Mark has had someone pop up in the middle of a meditation and walk over and stand right in front of him and aggressively start to resist what was going on. It can happen. But even beyond that, the more common responses are, one is simply an inability to stay quiet, to actually needing to move, needing to act, needing to look at your device, your phone, your smartphone, whatever it is, needing to, not being able to sit quietly for as long as 20 minutes, but needing to distract yourself and get yourself away from, to avert that experience. Now, the second most common thing, or maybe the first most common thing, when you get people into an environment like that, you have a darkened room, you have quiet and peace, you may be playing Tibetan bells, so there are different ways to do it. It's for people just to go to sleep. People simply go to sleep. Jack Kornfield, one of our famous California teachers, says it's poor man's nirvana. Well, I mean, it's a little. I mean, that's a little bit cynical, but it's also fair that people, you give people who are experiencing their life as a struggle, as stress, as dukkha, on an ongoing basis, and who are used to finding distractions as one form of diversion. Another way is that suddenly, and they relax and go to sleep. Yeah. And we had a workshop here about a year ago. I can't remember if you were there, but we got together 4 different people, two of whom are teaching. One is a Vietnamese monk. One is a South Asian woman who's teaching at the University of California. Both of them have been teaching in prisons, teaching meditation and yoga. Third one is our head of psychology here at US, Ashley Coleman, who is a black woman who grew up in Oakland and is head of psychology here. And then there's me, older white guy sitting here. And we all were talking about our common experiences in these situations. And we all more or less agreed that, sleep, relaxation and sleep is one of the most natural responses when people first try to meditate. They're not driven by spiritual ambition to stand up, sit up straight, and make everything happen. So it's very normal for that to happen. Leaving that aside, the next question begins to be, if I can assure people that there is a reason for practicing. This morning we had a student that I've taught for quite a long time who's a soccer player. And I said, Guillermo, how long have you been playing soccer? And I said, 8 years. And he said, no, 10 years. And I said, how many times a week do you play? And he said, probably 3 times a week. And I said, well, it's the same way with meditation. You practice. You don't just spontaneously, or very, very few people, spontaneously develop strong meditation practice. You simply have to be resilient and consistent, tenacious, if you will, in your practice of meditation. But when you do that, I told the class this morning, I absolutely promise you that it will change your life if you're willing to make that level of effort on a daily basis. And even if you only do, they've done studies up at the King County Women's Detention Center in Washington State, and they wired up women in the detention center and found that when they did 10 minutes a day, they got measurable results in brain responses. 10 minutes a day?
It impacts my life if I can.
Yeah,
if
I know you
10 or
do.
20
Yeah, I know
minutes.
you do that. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That little bit. So I guess if somebody's starting out, a lot of techniques will allow you to sit with those difficult emotions that arise, or if you feel restless, you acknowledge it or look at it.
You notice it, yeah.
But for somebody that's just getting into it and overwhelmed by that restlessness or aversion to the practice, is that the advice you would give them? Just kind of keep trying?
Oh, I tell them to get up and move, for one thing.
Don't punish yourself.
Right, exactly. I tell people,
go for a walk and come back.
If you have to move, do that. And I also tell them, as in the Buddhist tradition, there are 4 types of meditation. There's walking, sitting, lying down, and standing. All 4 of those are within the Buddhist tradition are acceptable practices. So I tell them you can change your posture and try that. And I say just do the best you can. Try and be resilient to the best you can do it, to the best you're able to accomplish that. Try and be relaxed and resilient to the best of your ability, and be patient. There's a lovely passage that comes from St. Paul in the Bible, the New Testament, that says, "By your patience, possess your soul." And it's a very lovely passage. I use that as a mantra these days. I'm not, I don't know. I suppose I'm a Christian on some level, not orthodox in any way, but that phrase, "By your patience, possess your soul," is to me very, very useful, very helpful, very kind and gentle guidance.
I like that. In my experience, doing some movement before static sitting is tremendously helpful. So generally, I like to do some yoga before I sit and meditate. But when I've gone to retreats or stayed at a monastery, sometimes they'll have us do, even at some places required to do 10 minutes of walking meditation before you do the sitting.
It's a very common practice.
And my goodness, it helps me to settle into the space. Normally, I have to sit for about 20 minutes before I can settle into the space and stop being so restless. But if I do that 10 minutes of walking before I sit down, just a couple of minutes, if that, and I'm feeling more comfortable.
Yoga is very important, I think. It's a form. By the way, sitting meditation is a form of devotional yoga, in my opinion. It's not something separate from that. But I can say when I began to meditate, I used to be quite strong. I did a lot of weightlifting from the time I was a young man. I did 100-mile bike rides. I did one triathlon once over in Switzerland.
Wow.
I've done a lot of different forms but I was a little too strong in conventional ways and not flexible enough to be comfortable in doing my yoga. I'm doing my meditation, my yoga, my devotional yoga. So
well, they say you do yoga asana. Asana is they call it postures now, but it literally it's seat. it means seat, because that's the original yoga posture, is seated, right?
That's right.
That's great. So before we wrap up or talk about Buddhist meditation, I did want to ask you what's the difference in the approach from the AA program? And maybe before you answer that, I'll just share my experience in recovery. So I've been going to AA meetings since the time I was a kid because I went with my dad. But when it came time for my own recovery, I had no desire to go to AA because one of the tenets is you have to give up your power to a higher authority. And I felt like I needed to be empowered to make my decision to abstain. And also there's, I don't want to say a culture of relapse, but there's a lot of discussion of relapse, and when people sit around talking about things, I don't know if I could sit around in a room and talk about drinking all day without wanting to go out and drink. So I avoided a program, and I didn't get into Buddhism heavily until maybe a year or two after I was already sober. So what I did for abstaining from alcohol is I just made myself busy. I woke up super early and cleaned my whole house and garage over and over. I ended up getting 2 jobs in a volunteer position, so I was waiting tables at 2 places and then volunteering at the LA County Arboretum and Botanical Gardens. And at the risk of triggering anybody, and I don't mean to encourage anybody in the wrong way, but I also increased my cannabis intake, which is maybe swapping out one thing for the other, but it certainly was less harmful and allowed me to, I don't know, just to be more present, because it is definitely a way to avoid things, but I engaged with it. But anyway, so I didn't do any programs. I ended up making a sober friend at work, and we hung out a lot, and so I had some support from an individual person, but I didn't do a program, although it's tremendously helpful. And as I went on, I felt like I did need somebody to talk to from time to time, and that wasn't always available to me, so that could have been nice. But what would you say is the difference between the AA approach and a Buddhist recovery approach?
I want to be careful in talking about this, because what I will say is that I have a lot of familiarity with 12-step programs and how they operate, and I know that I teach about it, the 12-step literature. And in fact, the article I wrote for Danny Fisher in his book, 1,000 Hands, talks about 12-step programs. So what I can tell you is that it's a common reaction for people to think that AA actually developed from a Christian program, the Oxford groups, back in the 1930s, which was actually sort of an effort to rediscover. It's interesting, in the early 20th century, there was a Buddhist movement in Thailand, the Thai forest tradition, that was trying to rediscover original Buddhism, and in the United States and in England, there was this Oxford group movement which was trying to sort of rediscover Christianity. Anyway, so the AA in the 30s, developed in the 1930s, had its roots in that tradition. But the AA literature, as it's developed, has become very clearly non-denominational. And the question of the fact that they use the word God, they have a pamphlet in AA now called the God Word that talks about problems that many people have, and there are agnostic AA meetings, there are meetings in 12 steps. From my opinion, the AA literature is very, very clear. AA is not specifying that you have any one particular belief system. In fact, AA says God as you understand God, which leaves a pretty wide open door.
Yeah.
And for me, the problem that I experienced as an alcoholic was that the AA literature says the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, although he usually doesn't think so. So acknowledging that self-centeredness, the obsession with self, was actually what I experienced in my drinking and using is a really important thing for me to acknowledge. I needed, in Buddhism we have a concept called papancha, which means the elaboration of self. It's an early Pali concept. It simply means that the self elaborates and develops and expresses itself in every form. Our personal cosmetic vanity, our clothing, our uniforms if we wear those, our credentials, our resumes, and on and on and on. Our vocabulary, using code words that it goes on and on and on and on. Only with alcoholics and addicts it becomes extreme. And so for me, the idea in recovery is to find a way to transcend that self-centered isolation and separation, and to find the inspiration to transform our lives. And I believe that that's what both Buddhism, in my experience, that's what Buddhist recovery movement does. And I believe that's what AA also does, 12-step programs, and other programs too. Those aren't the only options. There are many people have recovered in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Carl Jung talked about that. He said he was aware of people who recovered way before there were 12-step programs or Buddhist recovery for that matter.
Of course, yeah.
So there's been many, many approaches to this problem. But it's quite rare because the grip that alcohol and drugs gets on us is extremely powerful, can be extremely difficult for people. And the older they get, the more difficult it gets. So, Buddhism, my basic answer is that if you read carefully, Buddhism, the AA traditions, they have a thing called the spiritual appendix, which says basically, a spiritual experience is a change of personality sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. That's it.
Oh, wow.
A change of personality is sufficient, and that talks about finding an unsuspected inner resource. So whether or not, I'm not a traditional theist, but there's plenty of room in that 12-step tradition for people to find some source outside themselves that can lead to a personal transformation. And that's been my own experience. In fact, my as I said, I started to meditate in 1966. My meditation practice got very serious more than 30 years ago after I stopped using drugs and alcohol. Mm-hmm. I think the two, Carl Jung has an interesting phrase, spiritus contra spiritum. Spirits versus the spirit. And alcohol and drugs, in my experience, were serious obstacles to my being able to experience deeper insight or deeper understanding through meditation, through Buddhist meditation specifically. So,
wow. If people are looking to get started, interested in recovery, do you have any resources or directions?
I personally tell people to do it all. Do it. Yeah. Try whatever, and first of all, don't give up. People will go to one AA meeting and hear the word God and say, "I can't do this. I don't believe."
Yeah.
I think try 12-step programs. There's a movement here, actually now worldwide, called Refuge Recovery. Mm-hmm. There is a Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I think it's called Heart of Recovery, which has been going on for quite a few years. And there are other there's a lot of literature out there. Martine Batchelor is someone I like, who's written a really wonderful book about addictions. Kevin Griffin is another one. I ran into him, oddly, at a Buddhist monastery a few weeks ago. There's a lot of different books out there. There are a lot of different options. I encourage people to talk to others, find a community, or a sangha, if you will, in the Buddhist terms, a community of people who are focused on recovery and can work with you to support them. That's been the key thing is finding a community of people where we had a community of intent, community of intention, where we are following the same path and we're supporting each other in doing that. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Last question about recovery I want to ask before we start winding it down. We mentioned generational issues. My father and my grandfather were both functional addicts, and when my time came to avoid my problems, I turned to that as well.
Right.
But hopefully I've broken the cycle in my healing, and I think a lot of people are reflecting on their generational trauma and trying to break the cycle. And I'm curious if you feel the same hope for our culture in mass as I do, in seeing how the individual is looking to stop the generational trauma and heal. If that gives us hope for, say, even our country, because we have this history of genocide and enslavement and all of these things in our past that are fueling the violence and hatred in this country. And do you think that having so many individuals turning towards healing paths is giving us hope for our collective?
Yes.
Good answer.
I think it's an extremely discouraging time. One of the other byproducts of this, our saturation with social media, is that we have exposure to much more information than we've ever been exposed to before. And depending on how the news cycle breaks, and you think about this news cycle that we seem to be all caught up in, the latest discouraging news is being basically set out to each one of us in our little smartphones, and so it can be an extremely demoralizing and discouraging time to be alive. So I give tremendous credit to the movements of young people that are now stepping up in a variety of ways. I know you're aware of some of them. Going back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, mm-hmm. even well before that, of course. I mean, there's been a lineage of these movements. I claim to be part of that lineage, mm-hmm. and engage Buddhism certainly is part of that.
Yes.
So I don't know what our choice is. We simply have to keep stepping up, and we have to up our game, if you'll forgive the sports metaphor.
I'll take it.
We have to get more intense. We have to become more intense and more focused. And the young people that are coming out of Europe now, particularly, where that movement, the climate change movement, has really been generated.
You're referring to Extinction Rebellion?
That's part of it. Yeah, mm-hmm. That's one part of it. But in general, we simply, it appears that the critics, the people who have most forcefully raised the specter of climate change and its impacts, are right. We continue to get further and further confirmation. Things that were predicted 20 years ago are actually happening.
Yeah.
As we said already, it's hard to get people's attention, until the guy with Ebola gets off a plane in your airport,
yeah.
Or in your community and is wandering around, and it's hard to get people's attention. But we have to command the attention of people in the world, as many as possible. Powerful people if possible. If not that, then certainly young people who have the flexibility and the energy and the competence, in many cases, to raise these issues forcefully, and a willingness to sustain that effort. It's got to be a sustained effort, because, as I said originally to you, these forces are extreme. The forces of inertia, of wealth and power, are extremely powerful and extremely resistant to anything that challenges their sense of self-sufficiency, self-aggrandizement, and so forth. So finding that energy and that strength and that courage, and finding a community of people that we can work with together, is hugely important. I have modest hopes, but I get discouraged just like anyone else. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. As I think I said on the last podcast, I identify as a cynical idealist.
Right, sure, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm hoping for the best, but I'm not surprised when it.
And that's why, by the way, I do the social media stuff that I do. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many posts. I'm a Facebook guy, because I started when they started, basically. But I put up tens of thousands of posts on Facebook, and I just keep looking for good material from every possible source, including Buddhist sources, by the way, putting it up there and hoping that by offering it, I have, I don't know, more than 2,500 quote-unquote friends now, many of whom really are friends, and I just keep putting this material out and hoping that by making my small contribution to this process, if more of us do that and support each other in doing it, that's part of the solution as well. So. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, your page is wonderfully curated.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So before we wrap it up, I guess as the voice of wisdom and age here, do you have anything else you want to share about information or environment or recovery or Buddhism? Anything?
I think in a way I just said it. I think the thing I hope for the most is that this whole younger generation of people that are coming up will use their hearts and minds, their intelligence, and their deepest feelings to respond to the challenges that we're facing worldwide. And knowing that it's an extremely difficult task, that it's a hard task, and that there are many forces that resist for very bad reasons, for reasons of greed or hatred, ill will, and ignorance. But that's not new. What's new is that we are facing an emergency, and that we have to respond more powerfully, more forcefully, more successfully now. So,
I agree.
Good luck to us all.
Indeed, yeah. All right, so I'd like to just end with a few questions that I like to ask everybody.
Sure, please,
I'm always surprised by the answers I get.
Sure. Okay.
So the name of the show is A Flair for the Curious. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what is something that you're curious to learn more about?
Well, I'm pretty self-satisfied.
Yeah, you got a lot of knowledge and information.
Well, I just keep digging. You know, I mean, I find personally, because I have a bias to biology, I love finding out more about the natural world and about the species in it. And that's why it breaks my heart when I see what's happening in the Amazon, where we're destroying whole species without even knowing that we're doing it. Yeah. But every time I learn something new, I'm just fascinated to think. There's a small species of marsupial in Australia, where it turns out that the males die right after mating.
Wow!
And it's a new bit of biology that I'd never seen before, and I think that I've been kind of pondering that. I think, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. A little frightening for those of us that are procreating males or would like to be. You know, I mean, it's sort of thing. But you know, a friend I remember, and never mind. That's
yeah. Biodiversity is fascinating.
Yeah,
fascinating. So I guess I don't ask this question to everybody, but because you're such an animal lover, what's your favorite animal? If you had to pick up, maybe 2 or 3 even.
That would be extremely hard.
Too hard? Oh, fair enough.
Extremely hard
fair enough.
Say, yeah.
Dogs or cats?
Well, I have 2 cats. I have a blind cat that I keep at home named Ray. He was named for Ray Charles, I think, originally. And we've had him for... He was blind since 3 months old, and I've had him... Wow. We've had him now for going on 9 years. In fact, the end of this month will be his 9th anniversary, we believe, his birthday. September 28th. And he's been struggling with cancer for 15 months, but he's in recovery, apparently. So, you know, we love him. And the other cat is named Monk, and he was found at the Buddhist Biodiversity Monastery in Northern California. Oh, yeah, I've been up there. Yeah, I adopted him up there because one of the monks had told me that the foxes were after him. Oh. So I said, he's got to go with me. So we've had him ever since. So
that's great.
Yeah, he's going on 10 or 11 now. So
nice. Yeah. Cats it is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, for me. Yeah.
Cool.
I love dogs too, though. So
nice. Okay, so curious has 2 definitions. The other one is a little bit strange or odd or out of the ordinary. So have you had a curious experience or an unexplainable experience that is strange or maybe unexplainable?
That's interesting. Well, I've had experiences that are surprising in my life. I mean, one that surprises people very often is that I once performed as a dancer on the Miss America stage in Atlantic City.
Wait a minute, you're going to have to explain this a little bit.
My wife was going down there for a dance conference, and they were doing a dance performance, and they had a male dancer that got sick and couldn't perform, and so they recruited me. So I had to go out on the stage and do a grand jeté out onto the stage, go down on my hands and knees, and have a dancer come flying out of the wings and land on my back.
Wow!
So it was not a part that you could write out of the out of the equation, out of the performance, and so I did that.
Is there any footage of this?
I hope not.
Awesome. Yeah. All right, and last question I want to ask is, can you name a time when you experienced something profoundly beautiful?
Profoundly beautiful. That's a good
or profound beauty.
Mm-hmm. Well, the things that come to mind are more the things you actually are aware of this place. I mentioned it earlier in our talk today. I went out to Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, which is in the middle of the Mojave Desert. It's actually where the largest oasis in the Mojave Desert is. And when I first went out there, you drive for miles and miles through pretty desolate, high, hot desert. And you get there and you walk along a boardwalk or along a pathway, and you come to these beautiful springs, crystal blue springs with little pupfish, other species of fish, sometimes frogs or other animals in there. And it's just miraculous. It's miraculous to be in the middle of the desert. And in a way, it sort of makes me, it brings me back to our situation globally, that there is hope, that these little fish have survived in the middle of that desert for millions. I mean, these fish probably were swimming around the feet of mammoths. There were mammoths have been found out there back in the days when there were lakes there. These little fish probably swam around the feet of mammoths who were wading in that water. So, you know, it's that's what comes to mind most immediately, is just that beauty. And by the way, they're beautiful little blue fish. They're only about an inch or two long, but they're just beautiful, and I love that. And that's probably the thing that strikes me. I have so many recollections of experiences in nature like that, but that's one that comes to mind right at the moment. So
that's great.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, sure.
All right, yeah, this has been fantastic.
Great. Thank you
so
Anthony.
much.
Yeah,
I was wondering if I could make a request to you.
Sure.
Before we formally end, if you could close us out with the English version of the Buddhist chant that you offered.
Oh, I'd be happy to.
At our prayer service.
Yeah.
I've listened to hundreds of Dharma talks, and I've heard this chant recited in Pali many times, but you're the only person I've ever heard recited in English, and I think it's valuable for people to hear that. So I'd be honored if you could
Thank you
close
for
us that way.
Yeah. What I can do is I'll start with the way that a Buddhist Dhamma talk often begins, which is to say, Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. And that means basically homage to the Buddha, blessed Buddha, and it ends with, I bow to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So what you asked for is the Metta Karaniya Sutta, which is in Pali, and it's the often translated as the Loving Kindness Sutta, and I'll try my best to get it here. So, this is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud and demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease, whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great and the mighty, medium, short and small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another, or despise any being in any form. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child. So with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upward to the skies and downward to the depths, outward and unbounded, freed from hatred or ill will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, freed from drowsiness. One should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the divine abiding, by not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom.
Sure. Thank you very much, Anthony. Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for listening all the way through to the end of this conversation. I really enjoyed having it, and I just want to say thank you to Tom so much for taking the time. I also want to say thank you to University of the West for lending us the space to record that conversation, and for introducing me to so many wonderful professors and scholars like Tom Moritz. It's really a blessing to have that U.S. community be a part of my life these days. Send me your feedback. I'd love to hear, what did you think about our episode? Is there something you are curious to learn more about? email me at aflareforthecurious@gmail.com and let me know what you thought. Would you like to learn more about Buddhism? More about addiction and recovery? Are you an environmental activist? What's going on these days? You got a protest you want to promote? Let's make some magic happen, because this world is falling apart, and I think it's gonna take us to save it. And Tom's information and scholarship and outlook and support, I think, really lend itself to making strides in progressive politics these days. All right, so let's see what else is on the agenda. I'll give you a little preview of our next episode. We're going to take a little bit of a different turn. So we talked about addiction and recovery, and for some, our next episode might be a little bit of a flipping of the script. The next episode is featuring my friend Jessica Gonzalez, also known as the Mommy Jane. Jessica is a cannabis educator, influencer, and someone who is active in the work of destigmatizing cannabis use. For all of us, for parents, times are changing and things are different these days, and it's important to have advocates like her out in the world and people who are doing it in a fun way. So, she's got a lot of followers on Instagram, and she's made the cover of the High Times webpage. She's pretty incredible, and I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation. Head over to aflareforthecurious.com and you can find more episodes and links to some of the stuff we talked about in this episode. And as a reminder, I am a college student who is putting this podcast out with my own time, money, and effort. So if you are finding some value in what you listened to here today and would like to make a financial contribution, I invite you to do so. You can click the donate and support link below, or the tab on our website, and make a donation through Cash App, Venmo, all the PayPal, all the easy ways to do it are available to you. Okay, friends, again, thank you so much for the support and encouragement. You all have been so wonderful in sharing yourselves with me, and I look forward to hearing from you again soon. Remember to stay curious, never stop asking those great questions, and keep your hearts open. Have a great one, everybody. Peace.